Hi, my name is Patrick Lynch. I'm the founding director of Lynch Architects, and I'm recording a talk that I gave last year in November at the Barbican, because the recording was lost, sadly. So I'm sat in the office in Hackney on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully you won't hear too many noises in the background, and I'll try and recreate the adrenaline-filled energy of that evening in November. When I gave the talk, then it was followed by a discussion with Ellis Woodman, the director of the Architecture Foundation, and Claudia Lynch and David Evans, my co-directors. The talk was dedicated in large part to my PhD supervisor, Joseph Rykwert, who died not that long before last autumn, and so it's quite an emotional occasion, and I'm recording it in part not only to create a kind of snapshot in time of where the practice was then, but also to try to honour Joseph's contribution to my education, both as a theorist, I guess, and as a designer. And the title of the talk, Detailing Strategy, Body and World, it's kind of homage to him. The practice, as I said, is comprised of three directors: David Evans on one end of the group and me on the other, Claudia in the centre, Carol James, Rachel Elliott, and Luke MacDonald, and an associate, Roy Gaylor, who actually took this photo. The talk's in three parts. The first part, Bodily World, derives from one of my favourite observations in Joseph's book, The Dancing Column, which came out in 1998, which was effectively when the practice began. I'd been doing competitions in '97, working part-time as a teacher and working for another architect in London. And by the end of '97, I got first kind of fee-paying commission, and I was teaching at Kingston, and we were using Joseph's book, The Dancing Column, Modern Architecture in the design studio, and I was giving history and theory lectures. And the killer line, which I keep returning to, is the metaphor that I have been concerned with is more extended, a double one, in that it involves three terms. A body is like a building, and the building in turn is like the world, which is not quite, but it's almost the conclusion of the final chapter of the book. And looking back, I think that even before I became Joseph's student in 2010, when I had completed a Master of Philosophy degree in History and Philosophy of Architecture in 95 to 96 in Cambridge with Thunderball Wesley and Peter Carl. And then when Peter Carl translated to London Met, I had the opportunity, very generously, they paid for me to do a PhD. And I thought, well, I'll ask Joseph to be one of my supervisors. So there's a kind of gap of about 12 years between me kind of formalizing my study with him and all of his work, and the influence he was having on me through the atmosphere of the Cambridge seminar, which he'd instigated in its previous incarnation at the University of Essex. And so kind of key to my education were I suppose these two books, plus On Adam's House in Paradise, The Idea of a Town, and The Dancing Column, were things that were really at the heart of my PhD research and my early projects as an architect. I think I can claim to say, looking back, post-rationalizing, I'm not sure how conscious I was, but there was certainly discussions, the atmosphere of what we were talking about in the design studio, both with my students and I, and many of them were also working in the practice, went on to work in the practice, was informed by that, I suppose, trajectory or tradition of thought. And Joseph was kind of working at the bodily scale, but he's always, I suppose, primarily concerned with human relations and relationships at an urban scale. And he had this kind of strange, I guess, idea that archaeology and anthropology were a way for architects to understand both the material world and also the social. And he was very much against the idea that road engineers had propagated that the Roman camp was a kind of, or the Roman city was a kind of proto version of a modern, highly serviced road engineered grid, and instead was convinced that actually the best way to understand the Roman camp was as a portable Rome. That each night the soldiers would put up a kind of image of Rome. They would mark out a cardo running north south and a decumanus running east west, and divide the camp into 12 pieces. And so the kind of modernist metaphors of the city being a system, he rejected, and he said that the town is not really like a natural phenomenon. So it's not organic and it's not a machine. It is an artifact of a curious kind, compounded of willed and random elements, imperfectly controlled. If it is related to physiology at all, it is more like a dream than anything else. Which, it's suitably enigmatic, but I'll try to talk about it in concrete terms, that statement, in the kind of spirit of design being kind of, in some ways, dreamlike. Joseph's idea that architecture was both body and world and building, it's an elaboration upon an observation by Alberti, obviously, whose treatise he translated. And in essence, the kind of triad goes from kind of body to house to city. You could extrapolate from that and say, well, actually, you could think even bigger and say, well, the body is the basic building ingredient for the house which builds the world. Or even that the body is something that mediates via the house between the cosmos and the world and the city. Now, one way of putting all these terms together, body, house, city, world, cosmos, would be, in Joseph's way, to declare the ritualistic aspects of architecture, the social life of cities, having a connection to an idea of something much bigger than human time, or much more important than simply being physical objects, but things which have communal meaning. But I've begun to think that that kind of organization is slightly wrong, in that if you think about ecology, which is effectively world, or if you like, nature, perhaps what one should do is not go body, house, city, world, cosmos, which is kind of small, large, small, medium, large, extra large. We should probably begin now to think about body, house, world, city, cosmos. That ecology is something that is part of urbanity. Now that's I don't think that's a new observation, but I think the ecological imperative has raised it further in our consciousness. The books that grow out of my study with Joseph, Civic Ground, which is a version of my PhD, looked at the relationship between architecture and site or landscape and spatiality. The theatricality of the Baroque city was a book that grew out of my MPhil at Cambridge and concerned a festival place in Germany. And simultaneously with Civic Ground, we published a monograph of the practice's work that dealt with the mimetic character of the imagination. So the role of history and theory as a visual guide, as pleasure, as something that is inevitable and which gives meaning to the work of an architect. And that subsequently led to further publications. There's 2 books that have just been published in the autumn last year by AMAC, the Portuguese publisher, about an office building in London, and Westminster Coroner's Court, both of which I'm going to talk to you about as we go forward. And so the office is this strange environment of lots and lots of books and lots of physical things. And in fact also a publishing house, Canal Side Press, which we run from within the practice. And I suppose what's stayed the same since 1998 is this fixation on the physical character of architecture, which for me is manifest through the physical craft of making architecture, i.e. models and large drawings, by which I mean that if architecture is primarily experienced physically, then my belief is that if you want to close the gap between a projected imagination of what something would be like and what it's actually like, in order to predict how people might react, then surely the digital has limits, that the physical is complementary to it, and we should continue to work simultaneously at many scales. I.e., a site model has some information within it. Larger scale drawings obviously have more complex information. But the old-fashioned way of designing that I was taught, I guess, and that was kind of prevalent, and perhaps still is in many British architecture practices, i.e. that you do kind of planning application drawings at one scale, and then you do some tender drawings at another scale, and then finally do some details when it's on site. I think it's problematic because it delays the physical characteristic of architecture too long, often to the extent that it never really comes to the surface in the digital production methodology. So this is a example really of what the studio's like on any given day. A drawing of somebody sat in a niche in a wall with the evening sun coming in through the windows facing west, overlooking Christchurch, Spitalfields, a very early project, and the sound of the bells. And so the situated bodily character of this small gesture within the architecture was kind of paramount early on. It's a drawing done much later. The project was built in 1999, I think. These two drawings also were done for the book Mimesis to illustrate a working method. I think before the kind of digital world, we didn't always scan things, and we didn't things are kind of stored away in boxes. On the left, a conversion of a Victorian warehouse building into a lawyer's office with a glass pavement illuminating a small meeting room in the old coal cellar. And on the right, another intervention into a warehouse building, both in Clerkenwell. I'm going to show you these two projects quickly. Bristol Street, our first kind of built project, I guess, that had a public face, is in the centre of the street of the image you're looking at. Sat in between Grade 2 listed Georgian house and listed Victorian workshops, and in essence, the subdivision of this glass screen into three pieces echoes in a mimetic fashion, if you will, the scale of the proportion of the domestic architecture either side of it, probably more like the Georgian than the Victorian. And then the introduction of etched glass on the pavement, which folds and forms a kind of store riser or window, kind of ghost of a window ledge, introduces a rhythm and a scale which otherwise isn't required and could be all one piece of glass, but it, I think, transcends a technical problem and instead introduces a human one, human dimension. And so the building is a kind of ghost or an echo of the Victorian and Georgian architecture. And just around the corner on Hatton Place, when my clients moved in, this was still predominantly bullion workshops, servicing Hatton Garden, where all the jewellers are. And they'd taken possession with kind of live work consent, which meant they could live and work in it, but the ground floor was just garage doors. And their brief to me was they wanted as much daylight as it to enter, but they needed privacy and they needed a psychological sense of protection. However, at the weekend, back then, I think it's still the case in the City of London, lots of the pubs, the restaurants closed, most of them, in fact, and the bullion workshops don't exist. And so there was a possibility of countering the defensive nature of the architecture by opening it completely. So in essence, the building is a big piece of furniture. It's a window seat. You can sit on it from the inside and from the outside. And some of the glass is etched, some of the glass is mirrored, and it opens. That kind of bodily scale, and it's effectively kind of size of a piece of glass that somebody can move, that you can sit in the niche, began to scale up. This is our old flat, and then on top of which we built a top floor studio for us to inhabit on Hoxton Street. And in essence, we simply extruded up the glazing with them. The estate was designed by a very good architect called Leonard Maniser, who I admire greatly. And in essence, we've just, as I said, just kind of taken that 60 centimeter rhythm of the patent glazing, and that forms the rhythmic structure of the new floor. There are stainless steel table legs, as it were, which are taking up soil ventilation pipes or disguising downpipes and gutters. And then the infill is softwood 50 by 200 mil columns with 50 mil oak capping pieces on the outside, and that everything is lined in structural birch plywood, which is effectively acting as a kind of plate. So there's no need for cross bracing. It's kind of anonymous, I guess. At the same time, we got a commission to do a house also in Hackney, in Dalston. And the client was a carpenter, kind of a gentleman carpenter, if you like, and his wife was a music journalist. And they bought a pub back in the, I think, in the 80s. And the site is the garden, if you like, of the pub is here. This is the garden of the pub, and there's a row of Victorian houses which with much deeper gardens this way, and we had this kind of task of trying to fit into quite a shallow site, a house. The way we did it was to excavate slightly. You come in here, or there's a ramp down, a bricky ground, new white bricks and bricks painted white externally, on which sits an oak balloon frame, which is the client's desire. They wanted a green oak frame, wanted something absolutely ancient, and effectively plywood used again to achieve this cantilever to get just enough space at first floor for 2 bedrooms and a shower room. The living room is situated on the top floor, the double height space here, and the balcony has this curious effect of, if you like, kind of ending the street in a way which the blank gables of the Victorian houses typically of London don't. They kind of, they abut each other. And we were, I guess, keen to make a connection between the bodily scale of the 60 centimetres of the structural grid internally and the glazing, and the civic scale, so that the building is making a contribution to the street scene. It was all clad in vertical oak, a range screen, effectively, where the boarding is. It's weathered here. The windows don't open, so we avoid the kind of style issue of looky-likey Georgian or Victorian glass, but there's ventilation panel. This is the kind of bricky lower floor, which is a heavily planted garden. And then as you rise up into the timber aspects of the house, the oak frame is complemented by, I think it's oak veneered MDF wall linings. And you start to see that this is the oak frame. It's green oak frame, so it's not seasoned, which means it's highly reactive to the seasons, to the amount of moisture in the air. It's all held together with these things called tree nails. I like this picture because it shows there is depth, and there is an echo again of the not just the typology but also the detail of the neighbouring buildings. There's views up at certain points. The back facade is etched glass to do with issues of visual amenity, i.e. privacy of the neighbours. And as you rise, this white glass west-facing corner, which glows in the evening sun, it has a curious, ambiguous relationship with the white painted solid infill panels of the room itself. It's a building really where I suppose the strategy and detail are the same. It's a building whose strategy is to amend and end a Victorian residential street, and its detail is to do it with an ancient material. Very, very handcrafted. And this is the contribution it makes to the street scene. So I guess that's kind of worldly architecture built up from the body. But as practice grew, we began to get more complex commissions, and I think the trick has been to try to hang on to the idea that there's a worldly body, i.e. that you don't lose sight of the bodily scale just because you're doing large-scale buildings. I'm not going to read this quote other than to say that the kind of theory within what Rykwert's talking about isn't just to do with the physical experience of architecture. It has to do with its symbolic or paradigmatic nature, whereby rhythm and order in architecture alludes to a sense of harmony of architecture within nature, and that's in some ways the way in which tectonics is an expression of thesis of nature, of the reality of the hidden structures that guide the appearance of crystals and shells. The stuff that Le Corbusier was onto something. I think that there's an inherent connection between beauty and proportion of the body and the things that we're attracted to musically as well. It's a kind of basis of harmonics in music as well as architecture. And so this kind of idea that a building is kind of paradigmatic, and in the case of Alberti's Palazzo Rucellai in Florence, offers more than just an image of domesticity. It also, with the creation of this stoa, offers a way for the newly wealthy Rucellai family to participate in the popular life of Florence. In the 15th, 16th centuries, there were a series of street processions that would go past the house en route to the main squares of the city. And these are pages from Civic Ground, the PhD, and in essence, what Alberti did was he said that a really important thing that an architect can do is teach his client virtue, our client virtue, and that virtue, which is the kind of moral philosophy, if you like, underlying design decisions, in this case meant persuading the client to buy a piece of land, to build a structure for them, to provide shelter for people and for artisans, and for them to then watch the procession as it went past, was as important as completing the building for themselves. And in fact, it's not complete. They didn't manage to buy this plot of land, and so the elevation isn't complete. But the way in which the building is able to participate in the city, nonetheless, was fulfilled. And the particular festival that was being celebrated was the feast of Bacchus and Ariadne, where Ariadne, who's kind of left behind by Theseus, was taken up as a symbol of the proletariat of the city, as somebody who's gets consolation in wine and song because they're brokenhearted, so it's a kind of a way for the building of the Stoa was a way for the wealthy family to acknowledge their reliance upon the city to provide them with their well-being, and the need for them to recognise the presence of organised popular culture. That's in one way kind of highly esoteric, but in essence, I suppose the message, Joseph would argue, I think, is that public space is as important as architecture, and specifically in the domestic sphere. And one of the most recent things that we published is this book about Neave Brown, who famously said when he won the RBA Gold Medal, we didn't think we were doing housing, we thought we were just making part of a city. And in the book Part of a City, which I wrote with David Porter, Neave Brown's ex-colleague, we as you can start with the Rykwert quote. I was trying to talk about the contribution that Brown had made, which effectively was to build on a typological modern architecture, by which I mean his great friend Patrick Hodgkinson, when they were both students at the AA in the 4th year, became very interested in the Inns of Court as a kind of English domestic architecture that could scale up to have a civic presence. And that was the basis for the work that Hodgkinson did with Sir Leslie Martin and Collins and John Wilson at providing accommodation for at Harvey Court for Cromwell and Caius College in Cambridge. And then those ideas evolved into the Foundling Hospital or the Brunswick Centre in Bloomsbury, which were inspired by this is a 4th year project by Hodgkinson and by their own experience of Georgian architecture, i.e. being students in Bedford Square. And Neave Brown, interestingly, he worked for the council, Camden Council, but he was also allowed to teach. He was teaching at Princeton and at Cornell with Colin Rowe and others, and writing a lot. He was a very prolific and very good architecture critic. And he, for example, thought that Lewis Mumford's distaste for the Georgian was kind of weird. Why should the fronts and the backs of buildings be the same? What is that duplicitous? And in essence, I suppose the early projects that Neave Brown began to build for himself and the Hopkins and their friends, this row of concrete, effectively party wall houses in Winscombe Street in Camden, has a kind of mixture of discrete elements. Either the ground floor can be accessed directly from the street, can be rented out, or teenage children can be there. But the garden is communal at the back. So there's a kind of anonymity. And Brown was influenced by Atelier 5, the Harlan housing. So there's I suppose Sandy Wilson would call it the other tradition. There was an emerging typological reference to pre-existing patterns of habitation, both in terms of dwelling and architecture, but also in terms of the relationship between private space, semi-private space, semi-public space, and public space, that informed then Alexandra Road, which is in essence just party wall architecture extruded to become mansion blocks, where the balcony becomes the intermediary space both in Winscombe Street and Alexandra Road, where the private life of the individual and the corporate or communal life of the housing and the city meet. So there's detail and strategy at once, if you will, or body and world operating the same way. Now we can return to Brown's work with the benefit of 40 years of tree growth and see exactly what he really was doing, which was creating a landscape in which housing could sit. It's, I suppose, the polar opposite of a lot of modern architecture, which is, buildings on pilotti or in columns in a kind of sea of cars, Anyway, so the structure of what I'm going to talk to you about now is kind of evolving this domestic architecture. There's a house which is on site, still on site, on Mare Street in Hackney. Our interventions have been working with Joe Bernstein, the landscape designer, a series of gardens and furniture items in the gardens and in the house. The house used to extend to the depth of the plot, but this is London Fields, this is Mare Street, it's north, south. It was built in 1697 for a Flemish merchant. It's a cube in plan and in section, and it has a square garden in front of it. Recently, a developer bought it, turned it into an office, and thus got consent to build housing very close to it in the rear. And therefore, our task has been to try and mediate between the overlooking issues of the new apartments and our client, who are a couple with a family, 3 children. The brief includes an art centre in the lower ground floor, and so a very formal garden at the front for those activities to spill out into festivals, performances, etc. And then a much more intimate garden at the rear. And in essence, what we've done is create a kind of fictional recreation of ruins of things that we know were there. So at various points, the house had operated as a working men's club, before that as a women's refuge. Elizabeth Fry operated out of this building. And so we know that there were washhouses and rooms where people were learning to become domestic servants. And so we've created a kind of fictive narrative of ruins of those elements in the garden. And then in the house, tried to do very, very little to the existing fabric. So there's a mixture of new elements placed in and managed deterioration, I guess, or kind of ruined character. We've introduced a new staircase in the position where historical research suggests there was a second staircase, and new timber panelling, which allows a kind of enfilade plan to occur. So you can close down these rooms. This is a music room looking onto the second stair in the hallway. Beyond is a kitchen, dining, living room, and then at first floor, master bedroom and a living room. So that the house can both operate as a kind of an intimate space, but also as for public use. By which I mean where the art centre and the extremely gregarious character of our clients kind of allow the building to have both an intimate bodily scale and a kind of worldly connection. The brick walls at the back are, they're kind of fictive. They're kind of ruins. Their purpose is to, along with the very tall trees that we planted, to disguise the neighbours, but also to create an intense sense of intimacy. So when you sit within the thickness of the walls on a bench and look south, you're conscious of this oak tree in the neighbour's garden, and there's water coming in to the pond, and there's a chimney, a barbecue. So it's extremely elemental architecture and very bodily, and an attempt to introduce a kind of new layer, by which I mean, if you think about, you can do the experiment now in the room you're in. If you kind of look at your finger, you can't look at the screen. If you look at the windows or whatever's on your windowsill, you can't focus on anything outside your window. The camera can, but human eye can't. So if you place things into the foreground of people's vision, they aren't aware of the background. The background becomes background. Disappears, blurs, and thus you have an intense intimacy, which allows you to be cheek by jowl with the rest of the city. I think there's also something going on about figurative elements in architecture, by which I mean chimneys and things that are kind of bodily, but also have a kind of linguistic content, whereby the eye recognises that even if you're not having a barbecue, the chimney gives it the character of a place. So it's not just a garden. It's not just to do with scale as size. It has to do with the intensity of one's experience of something and how the mind reads it as a place for potential inhabitation and occupation. These are photographs by our son, Valentine, who's about to start studying architecture. And the project is a kind of, I guess, a sort of unity of the arts, a kind of Baroque project whereby the garden that Joe Bernstein is planting is complemented by this wonderful mural by Thiago Mazza, which is kind of moving back and forth from plant species that Joe's planting in the garden, plant species that historically would have been in the garden, and are kind of elsewhere, something that's there in the planting of gardens in Hackney at the time, because of a plant merchant called Lodges nearby who were bringing plants from all over the empire and putting them into England. So plane trees obviously come from the Indian subcontinent and are ubiquitous now, but we will get hay fever, those of us that do, because this doesn't really suit our climate that well, or our physiology. So this is kind of very public and very intimate aspect to this, one of which is kind of international and part of the street in a very obvious way. Another project, which is similarly kind of hybrid between kind of domestic and civic, if you like, is a project not that far away, also in Hackney and Dalston. Shacklewell Lane has a green on it, which historically was used for livestock for grazing cattle, and our clients bought the property in the late 90s, and it previously had been a dairy and a milking parlour and a shop, and the building next door was a butcher's. So it's quite a deep site. This was the milking parlour, this was the dairy, and this was a shop, and there's a small courtyard. And they, over the years, got married, had kids, but were kind of schlepping back and forth in their pajamas and slippers. There's no connection between the animal architecture at the rear, if you will, and the domestic at the front. And there was this courtyard which was effectively formed by the shape of cows moving through, a small recording studio, and what we proposed to do was to remove the roof over this space and introduce some windows, thus creating a new courtyard, remove some ad hoc amendments that had been added at some points over the last decades, and remove this external WC, and then just build this much new construction, 5 square meters, I think, of a glass corridor link connecting the front to the back for the first time. This steps, because historically they would quite a lot of effluents and spilt milk and stuff that needed to be cleaned, and so the whole site effectively is stepping down to drainage here, which effectively gives us a kind of motif of a stepping ground. There's a shop, the client sells furniture, and a yoga studio. So the domestic entrance is here. Upstairs is 3 bedrooms, and then we process through the last corridor to the living room and the kitchen, and then above here there's another bedroom, and the recording studio, music recording studio remains, and a new courtyard. So the presence of the old lean-to buildings is still there, and these new cast concrete steps that are corresponding to the Hilda-Picking geometry of the, I suppose we call it, kind of cow motif. And these large-scale models, which we continue to make, are a kind of abstraction of the architecture. There's no colour, but there is, in the sense that the building is, you'll see, quite colourful. But just material presence of stainless steel fascias and hardwood timber elements. The exo shows how the ground is stepping, and the kind of idea was to try to do something that signified its new use, as it were, its new identity, that was sympathetic to the earth tones of the neighbouring buildings, the ubiquitous brick of London, and to introduce new timber elements that the screen opens to allow the yoga studio to be accessed. This is the door to the shop, and this is the door to the flat. New windows, again, fixed panel with an opening vent to the side, which avoids kind of stylistic questions of Georgian or Victorian. And then as you move through the house, the introduction of a new ground made of terrazzo, which is similar to the cobbles in the courtyard, I think, fair to say, but it's a sophisticated environmental devices, underfloor heating, there's lots and lots of insulation. So there's a kind of material continuity between inside and out. It's what slightly wider corridor, creating a gallery space. A new stair up to the first floor bedroom above the kitchen. I suppose the kind of courtyard, kind of traditional kind of courtyard type, gets slightly exaggerated through the creation of a series of them. Very simple material presence, but then the introduction of colour deep into the plan to exaggerate the effect of west light in the evening light. See the floor stepping. Ceiling has a kind of rhythm as well. Clients, we kind of both like Lewis Barbican very much, as you can probably tell. It's kind of obvious reference to us. elaboration of a large number of doors means that you can effectively just wander in and out in the warm months as these the two dogs do kind of run around playfully. Moving up a scale, but staying in Hackney, a housing scheme that we won in our competition in 2016, which has now moved to a contractor being appointed. Planning consent was granted in 2021, if memory serves correctly. This is existing and this is existing, and we're adding these 3 blocks. One assumed that it was bombing that had led to the destruction of large parts of Victorian domestic streetscape, but actually it wasn't. It was the planners. They decided to get rid of what is now would now be listed housing stock, and to build a tower to create a sunken basement level, literally, the road engineers are in charge, and a 3-story car park structure to the street. So you end up with this typical situation where the signage needs to try and tell you where you are, because the human animal can't really understand the territory it's been placed into. This photograph, however, is here. So there's a series of quite decent 1930s and 1950s estates neighbouring it. However, at the moment, as you approach, this is listed. There's a car park between you and the tower, and in fact, the car park structure, in order to ventilate it, literally creates a rift between the existing streetscape and the site, which is further elaborated upon by the creation of a kind of shallow bridge that further isolates the tower in a moat of cars and road engineering. Our solution has been to create 3 new blocks, which are parallel to Murray Grove here, and in this case perpendicular to East Road and New North Road. The result being a kind of natural perspective, focusing on, for the first time, the entrance to the existing tower building, and a building here which accompanies a 90s building here, creating a new route into this estate. This Hoxton Street's here, so if you're kind of coming from Hoxton Street, that's the main entrance to the site. If you're coming from Old Street, there's an approach from the south. This block is fully social rent. This is fully market, and this is intermediate housing. Yeah, it's kind of, I suppose, modest, anonymous background architecture in the way in which Neave Brown was attempting to make, in his words, a kind of civic anonymity. Architecture's, what's the word I'm looking for? Economic, modest. Everybody has corner balconies. This is the west building to the back of the existing tower. That's the approach I mentioned into the estate. But the delight, I guess, comes from the integration of and the introduction of a new civic ground. So in complete and utter contrast to the car-infested antisocial territory that exists currently, a series of colonnades and porticos which create layers of occupation both within the facade and within the groundscape. It's a stage, lots of planting. There will be retail use at ground floor. And so in the kind of search of more examples, I guess, of kind of typologically oriented modern architecture, I loved very much this building by Kahn, the Yale Art Gallery, which is an extension to the 19th century neoclassical gallery. A very, very simple floor plan. It's actually a reflected ceiling plan. And I would argue where detail and strategy is operating simultaneously. There's striations on the facade which create a kind of visual continuity between the two. And the reflected ceiling plan is all about this concrete diagrid, which allows a plethora of services to and for it to change, actually, for services to change, you know, cabling and lighting, fire equipment, fire safety equipment, etc. Kind of architecture of ground and the topography of the ceiling, as David Leatherbarrow might say. A kind of quasi-symbolic use of motifs in relationship to natural light, and a consistency of approach whereby this is the one building we were just looking at, in concert with Rudolph's School of Architecture and Kahn's posthumous Centre for British Art, a very, very good bit of city. You know, this bridge is here, kind of connecting parts of the university together. A very, very well considered urban contribution to the streetscape. Not something that's usually talked about in the histories of modernism, where people that like it tend to talk about it for its technological contribution. The people that don't like it talk about it for its antisocial character. I think if you scratch beneath the surface, there's already within, I suppose, late modernist architectural culture an extreme sophistication, tectonic architectural presence, not relying upon quasi-symbolic motifs, simply making architecture out of things, and in fact even quite overlooked, but nonetheless very sophisticated modern buildings, whereby the detail of the glazing mullion, which effectively runs up the whole face of the building in kind of imitation of the rhythm of the columns behind, means that you read this small office building by SOM as a kind of object. But it's an object which isn't scaleless, because the scale is the scale of the tectonic element which holds the glass in place. It has an open corner, which is here, so you can move through the plan at ground floor. Has incredible elegance and simplicity, which comes alive at night. I would argue very, very urbane architecture, totally suited to its purpose and to its place. It's subsequently been extended. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because what we've ended up doing, which is, I suppose, inevitable if you're an architect in London, which is a city made of, like most cities, of offices and housing. Been working for almost 20 years on Victoria Street, doing a series of office buildings and apartment buildings, which I'm going to show you now. And hopefully the theme of the worldly body is clear in the way in which the architecture responds to the setting of the train station, the Catholic cathedral, the town hall, in a way that seeks to ground these new buildings that we've created into a historical streetscape in the way in which some of the other buildings that were built in the 20th century and preceding us haven't sought to ground the architecture in a public realm, and also which lack a bodily scale. This is N2, this is N3, this is the building called the 66 building, and this is Kingsgate. They were finished about a decade ago. Previously, there had been fragments of historic housing, all of which was demolished in order to build a new ticket hall for the Victoria line, so that you don't have to exit the tube through the train station. You can now exit on the north side of Victoria Street. A very, very tall tower built in the 60s, if you like, completely out of scale with the streetscape. And our task, in essence, was to try to, I think, in a positive and creative way, critique the problems of this modernist landscape. This building here is cheek by jowl with Hawksmoor's new facade to Westminster Abbey. This is a photograph that David Grandorge took for us as part of our entrance to the Venice Biennale in 2012, when the building was just going on site. Kingsgate 6 was just going on site, looking at the rich hinterland of Victorian architecture and the rather mute and barren foreground of the street. So in essence, what we're seeking to do was to try and find a way to unify the background and the foreground, to intensify the sense of streetscape, some very interesting late modern buildings. I think this is SOM, and this is no, this is Seafert, and this is EPR. Beg your pardon. Just north of and east of City Hall, where modern architecture is totally and naturally integrated into the medieval street pattern. Things that postmodernism said it wasn't doing, I would argue that late modernism was already doing. This is the contribution that we made. We got a 1/3 scale facade out of CLT in the Corderia of the Arsenale, exhibited alongside House Hopkins and Eric Parry. That's the facade that we built 1/3 scale. We started off getting this site through, no, actually this site through competition, and then this site, and then these buildings, and then this building, and this, the first one we got planning consent for, weirdly, is going to be the last one to be built. There's a new pedestrian route introduced that runs along the back of Victoria Street, so there's a kind of quiet zone, as well as, I suppose, an intensified, I would argue, civic presence to the foreground. This is City Hall. This is the Bentley's Roman Catholic Cathedral. Originally, this composition of the town hall had two wings like this, completely blocking progress north-south, creating a service zone for cars at the back and a very bleak pedestrian experience at the front. And in essence, what we did was propose a competition asked for housing and offices, and we've effectively taken the grid of, or the open grain, rather, is probably a better word, of mansion block housing that Bentley built in order to pay for the construction of the cathedral, and placed it here next to the town hall, on the same orientation, and then using mirror symmetry through the centre of the public space between them, then created a series of blocks that step down towards the cathedral, which obviously is the kind of major heritage asset in this part of Victoria Street. The town hall's very big. It's kind of nondescript architecturally. And then the difference between the two gives us a repetitive footprint, I suppose, a genius loci, I would potentially call it here, of species of spaces that repeat across the site. Simultaneously, we were looking at how do we make a self-facing facade open. In essence, the mansion blocks that Bentley built are derived from the London plan of the 1750s, which limited the size of plots to around about 20-24 metres. So B in this instance is 24 metres, A is 12 metres, and that gives you the two public spaces either side of the residential building and the town hall, and then the office building and the residential building. It's furthermore broken down into parts whereby 12 by 10 metres is the rhythm of the ideal office grid. And then, of course, this is the imposition of, if you like, the kind of learned Scots, kind of, Corbusian, Colin Rowe analysis of Palladio and then Corb's architecture to try to create a kind of civic order to the architecture, so it has a kind of perfectibility, ideal paradigmatic quality. And this is a drawing of the city as a series of rooms. This is inside the cathedral, the forecourt of the train station, and so this kind of inversion of object and ground, or rather attempt to reconcile them, where the spaces between the buildings have a scale and a presence. This is the space between the two buildings, a very, very large model we made for public consultation in 2010. And then this is a photograph of Kingsgate Walk, which is a new public space in between City Hall and the residential building, with an artwork by Rykwert Luxembourg. This is the space between the two buildings, so it's lots of restaurants and bars and public seating. I suppose you could say kind of highly civic by being so close to the cathedral and the town hall. And this is the entrance to the residential building. So that column's here. And this, in contrast, is a much quieter, more domestic and intimate space. When we removed the existing building, rather when we contemplated removing it, the planners realised that there would be a scar of brickwork along the western gable of the town hall. And we were tasked with coming up with a solution. This photograph is looking from here, and it shows the change in scale from the double height giant order columns that frame the entrance to the restaurant on Victoria Street to a more intimate domestic scale. This is an axonometric of Kingsgate Walk. And so the solution to the problem of what are we going to do for the bare facade was to, in a sympathetic way, elaborate on the brutalist concrete architecture of Town Hall, but to introduce a narrative about the sustainability of the architecture, i.e. its facades which limit the need for fossil fuel use. And Rook came up with the idea of what's now called the Silver Forest, whereby the texture of the GRC concrete panels and the stone and the trees have a kind of there's a kind of mimetic character, if you like, both in terms of touch and in terms of images. And the point when you enter the building is the only one where you can see into the forest. Otherwise, there's a kind of noise and distraction and chaos. This is the facade of the office building. Has solar fins disconnected from the glass, so they get hot, but the glass doesn't get hot. It's a wall building it's low towards the cathedral and steps up higher towards the town hall. So the attempt was, we felt important to be made that we'd stop it looking like a slug. We tried to introduce some vertical character. And so the fins get close together as they rise up the building, creating delight, I guess. And they don't need to be as deep as they get when they get closer together, because they would just be casting themselves into shadow. They're designed to basically deal with solar gain in the summer, not just when it's at the zenith facing south, but also in late morning and early afternoon. So it's dealing with the sun from the west and the east. And in essence, there are a series of windows, if you like. So the figure of the body reappears within a street otherwise made up of mute, glassy, scaleless facades. The third element is what I call the doily, which is a piece of glass with a screen print of an onyx stone within it, and that deals with glare, but it also allows the fact that in some of the spaces there's ceilings and some of the spaces there aren't ceilings, and so you don't have a mismatch of that echoing across the facade. The facade opens, it can be used in mixed mode. You can see the view towards the tower of I think that's the Victoria Tower. It's not Big Ben, is it? Of the House of the Parliament. So the striated character of the vertical kind of finials of the Gothic somehow seeped into my subconscious. The effect of placing this building at this angle, i.e. discontinuing the grain of mansion blocks to the south of Victoria Street, has been to open up for the first time a side entrance into the portico of City Hall. It's got capillary cooling pipes within the concrete ceiling, so it can be used to introduce coolth. The facade opens to smoke vent, but also to allow natural ventilation. We also designed these door handles which relate to this very grand column in the entrance. You don't want a square column in an office building because the eye jags on it. You get two different kind of shadows. Like one side will be dark, one will be light. You don't want that. You want a sensation of free-flowing movement. It resolves itself into a square at the top in relationship to the die-grid ceiling. And this door handle, which is soft to your fingers as you pull it, or hard to your thumb as you push it, is a kind of, I guess, a kind of echo or mimetic echo of that grand object at a smaller scale. It's been quite successful. It's a produced them. I think this is the Royal Academy. Some of the students that we've photos that being used. It also works as a lever handle, the same principle. And then these are new door handles that we've designed for him to. This is the stone facade of Kingsgate, low-bearing facade. There's enough of them at the lower level to provide privacy for people in their pajamas or wandering around watering their plants, and they invert the order of the office building. They get further apart as they go up, so you have better views once you get above this building, and but there is still enough of them not to need fossil fuels, air conditioning to cool the building. This is inside the loggia, if you will, at the top of the building, the view of the campanile of the cathedral. And in essence, what we're creating is a kind of an anonymity. It allows all sorts of different types of occupation and furniture, mess, if you will, to coexist with an office building and the town hall. Kind of emphasis on the streetscape to create a kind of introduce life into the city. There's a huge amount of thought gone into the detail of the building, so you don't drop a glass off the building. The chamfer angle is there to, it's a health and safety issue, if you will, but it also introduces a kind of tactile dimension. This is the ionic screen in the office building for glare, and then used for privacy in the apartments. A view up. So these step in as they rise, because they don't need to be as steep. So there's a kind of, I guess, intimate detail or intricacy, as John Mounier might say, happening within the architecture, as well as it basically just being a kind of background for things that happen there. The army moving from Buckingham Palace to the House of Parliament. These are workers in the town hall demonstrating. N2 and N3 have evolved as some KPF master plan has evolved, and eventually where we've got to is a removal of buses and the introduction of a clear line, a route through the KPF master plan connecting Belgravia to Cardinal Place and then on to King's Gate and Zigzag. This part of London, as you probably know, is highly congested below ground with tube tunnels and sewers and whatnot. The solution to this structurally was a huge grid of steel structure becoming a truss at ground floor, founded in only 4 points, which creates a kind of strange new typology of a kind of a colonnade. There's a difference in the site. It was 1.5 meters here lower than it is here. We work with Jane L. Gibbons and Marf Landscape Architects, who we're working with on other projects, to create. This is their wonderful solution. It's a disabled access ramp, but also some steps to get you up to the western entrance into the building, which becomes a kind of garden. I'll show you some photographs of that in a moment. It's effectively a kind of feat of high-tech engineering, this whole thing. It's a plant room at first floor, so the top of the building doesn't have plant. There's the Neave, if you notice on the plan, there's this circle element here, which is it's an exclusion zone, effectively, for a cherry picker to lift up the manhole cover to gain access down into the tunnels in case the sewer ever flooded the tube line. And that circular motif becomes a clue to the geometry of the plan and some of the elements within the architecture. It also allows air to be brought in and, to the plant room at first floor. It's a simple floor plate core here, the only place we could found it. Reception area with a balcony overlooking Buckingham Palace to the rear, to the northwest. Area to be cellularized, open plan at the front. This is level 13, which has a double height loggia. And then level 15 was a club room or party room for the occupants of the building. This is demised as by a tenant, and then a timber screen. That's level 13, but that's level 15, a triple height space, and then the ground floor entrance. The vapor barrier or building line is set back from the colonnade, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. I just want to show you these images because this is a CGI, this is a photograph, and what we learned from working with Richard Coleman and Francis Goulding, townscape specialists, was I guess the kind of picturesque method that Gordon Cullen talks about, that Pevsner talks about in Oxford, that the composition of buildings can be understood in a painterly manner. So, for example, the pub, the Duke of York, Frank Matcham's beautiful Victoria Palace Theatre has now a backdrop which mediates in scale between the very, very large buildings and the, I suppose, domestic. This is, you know, Georgian housing, but then become analogically a palazzo type, i.e. the Victoria Palace Theatre. And then now, when viewed from the proscenium gateway of Victoria Station as you enter the city from the southeast of England, there is, according to Giancarlo Floridi, the Italian architect and critic, now a palpable sense of a piazza in front of the train station, simply caused by the layering of these facades, whereby the figurative elements of a grand arch, a middle layer, and a cupola echo in a slightly abstracted manner, and the early office building typology of having a base, a middle, and a top in the image of a grand palazzo that Adler and Sullivan were building in America. It is resuscitated to create a middle ground of city. This is the disabled access ramp and steps. The consequence of the curvilinear geometry is to create a series of patches of earth which have been filled with trees and a bench for the public to sit, south-facing, so it's very successful. People use it, I mean. And the curvilinear geometry is followed through in the detail. So the strategy, if you like, or the geometry of the plan becomes a way to deal with the problems of buildability. Concrete clad steel truss, and a new colonnade, and a timber ceiling which changes the acoustic of this space dramatically, which continues inside. Finally, the west and northern elevation. It runs around. There's a bike entrance and a room for the people that manage the building. So there's an outer layer of concrete structure, an inner layer of this softwood timber, kind of folding and draping, and then the metallic layer, which is the glazing system, becoming more solid. So it's kind of a little piece of public generosity, of room for the people managing the building to have a view. And a garden. That's the manhole cover, and this is the circular turning circle, turned into a quasi-public private space. There's a cafe in the ground floor of the building. This is it spilling out in the summer months. Doors that open to allow you to move through the building, so that the ground floor is effectively all there's a small reception desk, but mostly a cafe. And on the level 15, a communal room, clad in timber, auto lights, because the only other space I've been into like this was the Savoy restaurant on the 9th floor of Auto's building in Helsinki. So a kind of homage through plan and through materials to one of our heroes, and kind of mimetic of the metal and the body of the tower. It's level 13, level 15. And this is N3, which is just got planning consent the other day. Another office building now. Previously it had a public library in it. It had housing at various times until the council decided they would rather have the money than the public benefits of architecture. A south-facing facade next to the Frank Matcham's Theatre facade. I suppose a kind of quasi-ecological architecture. We first started working on this back in 2007, I think. And so the idea of creating balconies that solar shade the facade and add a human scale to the city was there for a very long time in our architecture. The building will have a 1930s pawnbroker's shop and facade incorporated into it, and a public route around, and lots of access to LUL assets that you can't really tell, but a lot of that facade is ventilation for the underground. So if you like, early 19th century, very early 20th century, early 21st century, an evolution of the worldly body of architecture. And then in the background, something with less detail on it, in the way in which, you know, when you paint, the detail disappears in the background, and you'll mix white and black and to form grey to create depth in the individual field. So this is what I mean by the kind of picturesque or painterly character of city composition. And I think that actually, because the heritage assets have more detail on them and are more delightful, the way you eventually begin to read the city will be that the other buildings of, I think, questionable quality will disappear. And instead, the consolidation of this island site, as it's known locally, will be helped by the introduction of a mid-scale architecture that steps and mediates between the scale of very, very big and really quite small. Okay, the final part of the talk, the poetics of body and world. So if there is this other dimension beyond nature to architecture and beyond city and beyond body that Rykwert alludes to, what might that be? Well, he thought that it might have to do with the fact that, unlike other animals, we don't carry our shelter around on our bodies or wear it. You know, we don't have fur, and we don't have, unlike tortoises and other animals or crabs, you know, shells. And thus we experience a kind of primal estrangement in the world. And what is necessary is the representation of this primal estrangement, the constantly renewed ordering of the metaphoric experience and its reenactment in the maturation process of the individual. And what representation is more elemental than reflection? I.e., that we reflect in our environment our longing for home, and that is something that extends from our body to the world through the natural world, understood as a fragment of cosmic order, and that places that are successful in situating us in resonance with the cosmos ground us and make us more fully human. I suppose Heidegger would say that this has to do with the poetic dimension of dwelling, quoting from Hölderlin's poem, Poetically man dwells, full of merit, yet poetically man dwells upon this earth. And that kind of philosophical understanding of the relationship between architecture and poetry has been at the heart of what we've been doing in the practice. One could call it civic, or one could call it domestic, you could call it tectonic, you could call it ecological. But I think there is this other sense that architecture acts as a kind of mediating scale between our needs for privacy and territorial security and our gregariousness and our willingness to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think the first time I started to become aware of the power of that dimension of architecture and of my own ability to subconsciously, I think, not theoretically, react to it was the opportunity we got, firstly from a London artist, to build a villa, if you like, a holiday house on the North Norfolk coast. This collage is made up of fragments of photographs of the beach at Holcombe, of the horizon immediately to the north of the site, and our proposal. North Norfolk floods regularly. This is Burnham Market, the village here, and this is the site for the house on the outskirts of the village. There were built, I think in the 1950s, a series of bungalows by a builder with no reference really to the view. The house was called Marsh View, but it had no view of the marsh. This is the long beach at Holcombe, and this is the sea wall that the Dutch built, which separates the salt water from the fresh water, and thus created the possibility of the extension of arable agricultural land. And the house kind of sits at the edge of that. And going there with Claudia in 2001 to visit our client Alison Mitchell in her bungalow, we were struck by the huge expanse of the horizon and the strange way in which our shadows created some kind of scale. That's the bungalow. You had to walk around like this to the side to enter it, and they had a coal store facing north, so there was no view of the marsh. It paid no heed to the solar orientation, the warmth of the sun. And in essence, what we did was add a front extension and add a back extension. And then in 2008, we went back and we added a carport, a store for the oil, for the oil tank, for the central heating, and a studio for a second set of clients. And you effectively arrive here, go up a shallow ramp into a small room for dyeing clothes. The original client was a textile artist, and a boot room through into the kitchen. And then at this moment here, you start to become aware from the dining table of a view out of the marsh. And so you've gone from being cramped in a car to beginning to come in carrying things, putting them down, and then becoming more upright, and then being confronted with a space that rises vertically quite dramatically, with a roof light that brings the sky into play, and a chimney. The geometry of the pieces are fragmentary but harmonious, I would guess you could say, or they relate to each other in a way that isn't obvious but becomes more obvious as you move around. A kind of abstraction of local vernacular architecture. Very, very tall chimney with a roof light and large glass sliding doors that mean that in essence you're kind of camping in a tent at the edge of the wilderness. This is the marsh beyond a pond to stop you falling into the marsh. So suddenly that ad hoc or willy-nilly kind of collection of bungalows have the character of a place. This is a view from the coast road to the west, the tall chimney in the afternoon sunlight. The carport, a kind of architecture beginning at the scale of the chassis of a car, a low concrete wall that rises to enclose the oil tank, and then literally a room with a view, just a door that expands to give you a view of the marsh, a pond, a mirrored wall with a window in it, which means that at dusk, when the lights come on, you're suddenly visible, so that's the time to return to the collective. This is as you're arriving, the carport, studio, the entrance. Entering into the boot room, into the kitchen. And this is the 7.5 metre tall space in the living room, light falling from above, and the fire. There's underfloor heating in the building, so there's no need for a fire in technical terms, but I think there is in psychological terms in this location. A figure that mediates, if you like, between the sky and the horizon, giving a sense of human occupation. And then literally the use of reflective materials to enhance your experience of the natural world. This is the master bedroom, and here is the bathroom, and it's actually the mirrored wall is hiding a boiler. That's the studio, its mirrored wall. This is the room with the view I mentioned. North light, very good for artists. Use of colour. And then at dusk, the light's coming on. An intensification of a sense of place. And you see the kind of fragments of the building completed in reflection. Some Dutch children stayed there, and I'm very impressed. I'm not sure if it's the most beautiful, but I think I know what they mean. There's something about it having a kind of archetypal character that allows it to become meaningful to people. A larger scale version of this, I guess, is this project we've just completed the workstation. It's about to go for planning. A family hub is a kind of shore start centre. That's a line of Victorian houses that were converted into a school at some point, a special needs school. Now special needs children are not isolated in their own building now, integrated back into schools. So Westminster City Council had the opportunity to reinvigorate the architecture and to create a new typology, if you like. Family Hub has primary medical care for young children and pregnant mothers, postnatal care. It has on the first floor adult education classes. It has social workers rooms and play space and buggy store and new plant room. And in essence, it's a kind of elaboration on the vertical roofs of these Victorian buildings, becoming a big house. So a room for children that's both recognisably domestic, and through the creation of a series of courtyard gardens, something for people who come from all over the world and live locally and make use of these local government services to have a sense of communal ownership of the big house being the courtyard being the thing, I guess, that kind of mediates between the scale of the domestic realm, the private realm, and something shared. Last couple of projects, barn in Essex, which is here, which is a threshing barn for the 17th century, piggery, and stable. So a kind of little community of buildings. Nearby, there's this beautiful black painted barns all over East Anglia, kind of mute, silent, modest, very reserved, but with a charge void, if you like, as Smithsons might say, kind of spaces between them of potential. It's our first site visit. And it struck me very powerfully that we needed to retain a sense of its agricultural character and its slightly strange otherness of buildings not designed for humans but for animals. And that we should try not to do a barn conversion that would destroy that strangeness, its vast spaces and repetitive materials. And we should try, through the introduction of new landscape elements and new pieces of furniture, to retain the relationship between landscape and buildings, with large-scale models. And so in essence what we realised was that to make it function for humans, we needed fire, we needed water, and we needed space of reflection, a space to work. Clients are landscape designer, so Joan Bernstein, I mentioned before, that we've been working on other projects with. This is her study, this is the kitchen. Her plan was to try to build a garden. In essence, that was the main motivating factor. Because it had a courtyard, it lends itself to the creation of two different types of gardens. One that is more verdant and benefits from the reflected warmth of the brickwork walls. And then one overlooking the agricultural land, which is a wildlife garden. So it's as if the field has come into the domestic territory. A series of new brick grounds and benches connecting the various parts together. 2 bedrooms, one here, using a kind of pod, if you like, bathroom elements. Very big doors that can open, and a new door in here past the bedroom. A guest wing in the stable and utility room in the piggery. Living space, dining space, kitchen. That's the study upstairs, and then a secondary living room that can also just, double up as another guest bedroom. So these plans are a bit blurry. That's the ground floor. That's the first floor plan. This is the study I mentioned. You'll notice there's an offset. That the barn is on north, south, east, west orientation, and that's because a threshing barn worked through the threshing of corn through the east and the west winds flowing through the building. So it's on cardinal orientation, a bit like a church. But the architecture adjusts itself to the ancient field pattern, to the roads. And so we realised there were 3 black objects that we were going to place into the hall, as it were, of the barn. 3 black objects, and that this one would respond intimately to the kink in the wall here. And so the microcosmic scale, the macrocosmic sense of there being 3 rather enigmatic black objects is repeated in the introduction of 3 rather enigmatic black objects into the interior. The whole building was renovated. The roof came off. Structure was fixed by a wonderful man called Joe Bisham. And then a new floor was made. New brick dwarf walls were made, insulating the building. This is a section through the bathroom pod. And we work very much kind of back and forth on hand drawings and CAD drawings. This is the view as you come. If you come from the train station, you walk over the fields, you arrive at this enigmatic object. The new intervention really is limited to the new unpainted oak windows. A new window here, cut here to reveal the structure and to give a view west. Building that can close and can open, and in so doing it reveals itself, reveals its structure. The wobbly roof is put back, so it has a sense of something very old. And of new things placed into it, so that human occupation is kind of temporary, if you will. It's still a barn primarily. It's just being occupied by human beings in a kind of provisional manner. So there's no mezzanine level, there's no plasterboard, there's no suburbanization occurring to the architecture. So we like to call it a barn non-conversion, if you like. So you see literally all periods of history, 20th century additions, original parts of the structure. There's no hierarchy, there's no snobbery about that. They're all part of history. The verdant inner courtyard garden, it viewed from the stable. And then the rear garden kind of bleeding into the fields beyond. Brick floor inside and out. I very much like this. This is just the necessary repairs that you do. You know, this could have happened a dozen times. How much of that door is original? Yeah. And a chain as a way to avoid Neave plastic downpipe on next to these columns. Steps up to the study. Joe had this idea of a reflecting pond that would stay the same. It doesn't move. Everything else kind of goes up and down as it grows and is cut back. But the pond is this thing that's just there all the time. It's kind of a miniature version of the courtyard, if you like, or the ridicule object. A way to intensely register the passing of the seasons. So the kind of nobility of the sky, the beauty of the natural world is elevated in your consciousness beyond simply being kind of food. In a way fulfilling the purpose of the villa as a place of reflection, where you go to make work, writing, poetry, etc. Which brings me to the final project, which I guess deals with the most explicit kind of cosmic dimension of architecture, which is death and memory and meaning. And in a very intense way, a coroner's court is a type of courthouse, obviously, but it's one where inquests are held to determine the cause of death, be it suicide, murder, accident, etc. They were introduced in the middle of the 19th century as part of the municipal acts in England to deal with the kind of increasing secularization of the English state. Previously, the Church of England, you know, kind of with the kind of hegemonic structure of the monarchy and the crown, the place where you get married and register births and deaths, etc. with a kind of globalizing population and a sort of kind of move towards secularization, town halls were built through the Metropolitan Acts and Coroner's Courts. And Westminster's Coroner's Court is unusual in that it in everyday use services also 3 other London boroughs, the kind of quotidian everyday deaths of daily life, but it's also very close to the centre of Westminster as the seat of national government, and is also used for the Grenfell fire inquest. The bodies were brought here, terrorist attacks on Westminster Bridge and London Bridge, that kind of thing. The building is centrally organised. There's a corridor running through the middle of the plan. It has a small arch, a window seat at the first floor. We built in 2018 a garden of remembrance, and then finished last year a garden of reflection and an extension. The land to the west will never be built upon because it's got a disaster mortuary. So during COVID, it was lined with tents and dead bodies. In the 90s, a mortuary was built here. Previously, horses and carts would drop off bodies and they would go around like that as a turning circle because horses aren't very good at reversing, obviously. And that original use was changed when they built the mortuary, and so these pieces of land either side of it became redundant, if you like. And that's the 90s building. This is the early 1900s Coroner's Court. Has a kind of funny character. Rykwert once told me that he thought it was a bit Beatrix Potter-like. It was kind of straining to be homely and kind of serious. So I think you could take a very generous view and say that actually it's incredibly empathetic and thoughtful. There's a very intimate scale of entrance. This window seat at first floor. It was quasi-domestic as well, because in the 19th century, if there was a suspicious death, if they thought you had cholera or TB, and somebody died in your house, you would be housed here on the top floor whilst they fumigated your property. This is the original Victorian courthouse. It's kind of secular sacred, as Peter Carl would say. I guess I think you would appreciate its use in this context, whereby there's barrel vaulting, there's light from above, there's a dais. Everything's kind of made of good, noble but not ostentatious materials. It's very like a church and a theatre in the sense that it's a ritual, it's a public ceremony. You stand up when the coroner enters. They enter from a vestry or small room to the side. When they don the gown, they become an agent of the state. They embody the justice of the king or queen. And there's an intense level of detail whereby the edicule, as John Summerson says in his wonderful essay Heavenly Grottos, the motif of the late Victorians, that the building is a small building within it at every scale, works at the newel post. It's typical actually of this area that this is an old Anglican seminary which has a niche and a bust and a saint within it. And there's obviously the Catholic cathedral nearby, where misericordia and choir stalls and tabernacles have this intense sense of microcosmic and macrocosmic scale. That's the window seat I mentioned at first floor. And within the original courtroom, there's faience tiles and the agapanthus plant, which is the symbol of love. So a very thoughtful architecture. Rykwert wrote this very curious essay once about the creation of the red telephone box, the kiosk by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, that has to do with the fact that when Scott was working on St Pancras Station, the train lines went through the graveyard of St Pancras Graveyard to the north of it, and the tomb, the family tomb of Sir John Soane, had to be moved. And the tomb itself had a kind of shallow vault within the entrance to the crypt, similar to the morning room in his house. And when Soane was tasked with the strange design of a new typology, a new building for speaking on telephone, Rykvert's theory is that he got the idea of casting inside of the vault entrance to the tomb, the crypt of Sir John Soane. I think it's a plausible idea. It's a nice idea. It's a very rich question. It's witty. You want it to be true. Anyway, the reason why I mention it is there's a red telephone box here. And my initial kind of reaction to this was a competition brief, was to think that if we're going to create a new courtroom, which was part of the brief, a second courtroom, which is also a room for the jury. So when there's juries sitting, they have a room for deliberation. If there's not a jury and it's a disaster mortuary, so mode, i.e. national crisis, you have two courts in session. And so I was basically thinking that the new courtroom shouldn't feel second rate, and that what we do should be a cast, if you like, of the interior of the original courtroom. Hence the reference to Gilbert Scott's cast of the inside of the Sonian tomb. And that this motif of the arch, or the little house, the aedicule, could give us a way to deal both with the Garden of Remembrance and the new building in a way where the kind of spatial typology and the kind of poetics of architectural character of these rooms, of upstanding rooms lined in timber, top lit, with the vault there to focus the voice and focus the attention upon the judgment of the coroner, could be the clue to how we might make a new architecture. There's a sketch section through the two courtrooms. This building's made of CLT and clad in Jura limestone. The striation of the limestone, Portland stone of the original building continues across, giving it a sense of scale. But there are no windows to the north and to the street. The cars behind this wall is a room for the bereaved families, and here is a witness and evidence room. So highly, highly secretive activities, if you will, requiring huge amounts of circumspection and security. So the way the plan works is you come in here, if you're called by the police in the middle of the night, you walk through the centre of the plan into the mortuary, and you enter the buyer room where you witness and identify the body of a loved one. You then go, if you wish, into the Garden of Remembrance and have a cigarette or a swig of something sustaining that the policemen carry with them. You go away for a few weeks or months, depending on the complexity of the case. If you return, you come in here. We've opened up a new opening to create a reception desk, and you would go into the waiting room with its own garden of reflection with a pond. Here is new accommodation for the coroner service staff, a kitchen for them, a receptionist, room for the press, toilets, and more waiting rooms. A grand stair that takes you up to the first floor, and then either into the old Victorian courtroom via the window seat I mentioned, which I think is a hugely sympathetic and empathetic act of bodily architectural furniture. You know, knowing that people need to sit down, they're probably in tears if they found out that somebody's committed suicide and thus they've no inheritance and they can't be buried on consecrated ground, etc. They're really very good architectural kind of spatial scale happening here, in contrast to then the large vaulted room. If you're going into the second courtroom, you would come in here. So the coroner, that's the coroner's dressing room, their office there, the toilet, WC. They parade like a priest or an actor to the back of the stage, the dais. Similarly, in this condition, if you're a jury member, you would be here. Or if the second court is in session, the evidence room becomes a robing room for the second coroner, and he perambulates down the corridor and enters behind his desk or the stage or the altar, if you will. So it's highly theatrical. There's very much a front of house and a back of house character. The corridor itself, the glazed link corridor between which is here in plan, between the two structures. Steps, it's lower at the front to be lower than the cornice of the original Victorian building, and it steps higher here because the facade of the internal facade of the Coroner's Court has very large windows. And so in section, as you're moving through the plan, it naturally guides you to the left, if you remember the public, because that's where the space gets taller. It can be subdivided into a small juror's room or large juror's room, or opened into a much bigger space. This is the west elevation, which, because nothing will ever be built there, will always benefit from lots of light. So there's windows on that elevation, not to the north. And to the south, there's a problem with you're just looking onto refrigerating chillers above the mortuary. So the building's symmetrical, but its setting in the city isn't. So you have a long approach from the north, where the new building, as it were, has its own presence. This edicular motif is typical of Victorian architecture. Even within a Baptist church, there's a strong sense of bodily scale rising to become the architecture. So in essence, this is a kind of genius loci project. It's the elements of the original building and neighbouring buildings condensed into an experience of similarity, of rhythm, of scale, of similarity. This is the garden of reflection, as it's called. The pond is here to stop you walking past the window of the office workers or seeing the delivery fire ambulance of the remains of the dead. Has a bittersweet crabapple tree sat within a planter. Behind the stone wall is the beton brue, the raw concrete of the wall steps down to the service room in the basement. So the theatricality is clear, I guess. So there's very much a front of house and a back of house, and that treatment of motifs of the materials continues throughout the architecture of the building as you move through it. Garden of Remembrance, originally commissioned for the Grenfell fire victims' families, somewhere where they can come and sit. No names, actually. Just we found this on eBay, so a Victorian fountain to provide some white noise. 2 squares and a circle, this kind of curved motif of the architecture of the building, giving us a clue to how to make the benches, and then a doorway you cannot enter. Inside the new arch to the reception, a view beyond to the offices, and then this is the room for the bereaved families to wait before they go into the court. The back of house that I was mentioning is very, money is spent in a variety of ways here, not so much, just the CLT structure exposed in cable trays. So as the technology improves, you have to rip out plasterboard and put in new Ethernet or whatever comes next. Strongly material presence. And then in the bereaved waiting room, a piece of stained glass by Sir Brian Clark. So because of the problem of security and the possibility of paparazzi long lens photography, we were faced with a dilemma where we wanted to look natural light into the building, of course, but obviously the privacy and even the security of people in highly charged emotional states need to be protected. And a couple of my old students were working for Brian, and we met up for a drink, I think, and suggested that maybe Brian might be interested because he'd been to the Coroner's Court a number of occasions when friends of his had passed away, and he was prepared to work very generously without fee, and even paid for the contribution of the glass. And his idea is, in essence, there's a need for some hope and for the motif of spring flowers. In this instance, what you're looking at is west sunlight coming in through a hit and miss brickwork wall that forms the boundary of the site, bouncing off of the pond into this room towards the end of the day, which is in essence a kind of ingle nook, a large fireplace, something bigger than a hug or an embracing arm, and soft blanket seating. A column placed into the plan in alignment with the timber columns in the office wall beyond, as a way to create a marker between the different territories in the room. So if family members are uncomfortable being close to each other because they've not spoken for a while, there is different spaces. And it's also, I guess, a kind of reference to the fact that Victorian graveyards, if you're in them, and you see the tomb or the gravestone of somebody whose life has been cut short, the typical symbol would be a column that's been cut off. And of course, everybody whose body ends up in the mortuary and ends up having an inquest, their life has been cut short. They've not died of natural causes. As you move through the building, this is actually a new arch as well. There's a fire curtain. This is a new arch. As a way to try to make a kind of an anonymity. We're not imposing ourselves on the architecture, and we're not imposing ourselves on the victims, the victims' families. The semicircular and circular motif kind of echoing as you move through the building. This is moving into the new glazed corridor between the old and the new building. I say that because I think it's the two buildings. There's stone on this facade, even though it's internal, not required for any performance reasons, but it's to mark so if there's two buildings, they're connected via this glazed corridor. To the north, blocking the views of photographers, and to the south, blocking your view of the naked reality of air conditioning plant on the roof of the mortuary. Intense experience of life. There's the tall window to the original Victorian courtroom. Acoustic panels, in sound insulation, very important. Light from above, light from the side. This is the movable wall, partly closed. And then I suppose the crescendo of one's experience is of the summing up at the end of the day with the delivery of the verdict, however painful, at least is for completion of a process. And at that point, the evening sun coming in from the west, it's exaggerated, the red light is exaggerated through the introduction of a new motif by Brian Clark, poppies, the national symbol of remembrance. So there's both a kind of material continuity, obviously, of continuity of motifs from the old to the new, and the introduction of something quite shocking, of blood red light at the moment when the verdict is delivered, with the building is in use as a court, because the last thing the coroner would want to do is bring you back for now in the morning to give you bad news. And so the making memorable of something very memorable, kind of secular, sacred experience of something above and beyond you, that justice has been done, that the cosmic, this equilibrium or unbalance that has occurred through the death has been re-established, with a sense that you know that through forensic medicine and the law, you have been told the truth. The consequence of the stained glass is that it contributes to the street scheme, obviously. And it does, takes on a haunting character. The petrified plant, Agapanthus, reappears in its cousin in the non-toxic version of Agapanthus in the garden of remembrance, which is also obviously the motif of the flower, of the poppy, where the body and the world and the cosmos come together. Rykwert concludes the dancing column with this admonishment, where he says, "The ultimate barbarity is the plain reading, is not quite what Adorno said, but something like it underlies much of his work on aesthetics. Plain reading of a building is the univocal, anti-metaphoric account of it that presents it as mute, as meaning no more than itself, the way it is built and used. Greek architecture shows how buildings should be conceived, how physical forms can relate to the fabric of human groups, to societies and communities. Building is, after all, the group activity par excellence, the most entrancing and forceful, the exemplary art of building, an architecture which then invites dialogue and touch, physical contact across the millennia. It cannot teach us, history never can, but we may learn from it." And I guess this is what I learned from Joseph Rykwert.